Usually when we look at a map of the world, there is this expectation of permanence.
Right, like it's just fixed.
Exactly, like architecture. You look at a continent, you see the solid lines of the coast, you see the oceans, and you just sort of assume that geography is this unshakable foundation of human life.
We definitely like to think the physical world is, simply too big to fail.
Yeah. But then you step into the world of global supply chains, of maritime trade routes, geopolitical choke
And
points.
suddenly that map looks a lot less like architecture.
It really does. It looks a lot more like a fragile living organism. You realize that what looks like a vast, limitless ocean is actually entirely dependent on a few incredibly narrow, incredibly vulnerable arteries.
Which brings us to today's source material, right?
Yes, today we have our hands on a text written by an author who argues that one of those vital arteries is essentially being severed, and that the world is, well, fundamentally misinterpreting the bleeding.
And we should say right up front, the source material we are looking at is profoundly dense. It's passionate. It's sweeping.
It's a lot.
It really is. It's a blog post dated April 20, 2026 from a site called Barkface.
Such a specific name.
Right. And the author prominently identifies himself right at the top as Barack Obama's first full-time volunteer in New York City.
Which makes you think it's going to be about American domestic politics.
Exactly, but it's not. The piece is titled The Strait of Hormuz, The World's Reckoning with Iran's Global Ambitions.
Now, before we really get into this, I need to state our mission for this deep dive, because this text touches on highly explosive topics.
Very explosive. Middle Eastern geopolitics, the role of Islam, regime change.
The actions of the Islamic Republic. So our goal today is absolutely not to take a side.
No, not at all.
We aren't here to endorse this author's right-wing or left-wing views or to, validate the intensely polarizing arguments made in the post.
I like to think of us as wearing hazmat suits today.
Hazmat suits, yes.
Yeah.
Perfect analogy. We're carefully dissecting a highly radioactive, deeply subjective piece of writing so you, the listener, can understand the exact architecture of the arguments being made.
We're holding the text up to the light to see how the author's mind works, not to tell you what to believe.
Exactly. And that is crucial because the author starts by completely reframing how we are supposed to look at the Strait of Hormuz.
Right, because everyone knows it's a waterway between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman.
Sure, we know it carries roughly, 1/5 of the world's daily oil consumption?
Something like that, yeah. But the author strips away that standard commodity market framing completely. They call the strait a mirror held up to the international community.
What's fascinating here is how they use that mirror metaphor to completely redefine the concept of modern terrorism.
Right, because they explicitly claim that the closure or disruption of this strait is, quote, the biggest terrorist attack in living memory.
Which is a massive claim. I mean, if you are listening to this right now, your mind probably immediately goes to 9/11, to hijackings, suicide bomber.
And the author acknowledges that, right? They know no bomb has detonated on a city street in this scenario.
There are no traditional explosives at all.
Right. Yet they argue the human cost is mathematically undeniably larger.
Okay, let's unpack this, because taking that concept a step further, the author argues that the global economy essentially lacks what biologists would call collateral circulation.
Right. Collateral circulation. Like
Yeah.
in the human body, if a minor vein is blocked, the blood finds another way.
It reroutes. But the Strait of Hormuz has no geopolitical bypass.
It really doesn't.
And the author tracks the instant global shockwave of its disruption to prove why this qualifies as planetary terror.
They lay it out step by step. A silent order is given to block or harass a shipping lane in the Middle East.
And then within days or even hours, factories sit completely idle in Europe.
Just shut down.
Yeah.
Because the energy required to run the machinery simply isn't arriving.
And it doesn't stop in Europe, obviously. Fuel prices absolutely spike in Asia, which relies heavily on that specific corridor for its liquefied natural gas and crude oil.
But here is where the author's analysis gets incredibly granular and, frankly, terrifying.
Yeah, they point to Latin America.
Exactly. They note that families in Brazil or Argentina are suddenly facing higher food costs because fertilizer shipments are stalled.
If we look at the actual mechanics of why that happens, it just exposes the hyper-connected, terrifyingly brittle nature of our world.
It really does. Because fertilizer production,
Specifically nitrogen-based fertilizers like urea, right?
right, urea, it's deeply tied to natural gas and petroleum byproducts. The ships that carry these raw materials, or the finished fertilizers themselves, rely on these open sea lanes.
And our global supply chains operate on a strict just-in-time model.
Yeah, warehouses aren't stockpiling months of reserves anymore.
No, the ships are the warehouses.
The ships are the floating inventory, so there's zero slack in the system.
Zero. When you pinch that artery, the pain is felt instantaneously by a farmer planting crops in the southern hemisphere thousands of miles away.
It's a mathematically devastating disruption of daily life.
The author is essentially arguing that you don't need a kinetic weapon. You don't need an airstrike or a nuclear warhead to terrorize the globe.
You just need to put your thumb firmly on the world's jugular vein.
The weapon is the geography itself. It's weaponized by the denial of access.
And they are demanding we recognize this as terror on a planetary scale, executed not with explosives, but with the quiet stroke of a pen.
And you can tell they are deeply frustrated that the international community insists on treating it as a localized traffic dispute.
Rather than an act of global war.
Right. But if the author believes the weapon has fundamentally changed, they also argue that the ultimate target has been completely misunderstood by the rest of the world.
Oh, this part is huge. The author writes, and this is a line that really jumps off the page, this never was Israel's war. Israel just so happens to be at the forefront of it.
Yeah, that's a provocative statement. They are taking direct aim at how Western capitals, diplomats, and global media have historically framed conflict involving the Islamic Republic.
For decades, the dominant narrative in the West has viewed these tensions primarily through the lens of Israeli security.
It's packaged as a regional dispute over territory, security perimeters.
The Palestinian question. Exactly. Localized power dynamics in the Levant. But the author is aggressively stating that this Israel lens is fundamentally flawed.
Dangerously myopic, they call it. And they say it plays right into the regime's hands.
Because if you frame it as a localized dispute, you imply it can be managed.
Right. You imply that with the right ceasefire,
The right back-channel talks in Qatar or Oman.
then the tension can be dialed down.
But the author says that framing completely obscures a much deeper, much older ideological current.
They assert that the Islamic Republic's rhetoric, its massive proxy networks from Hezbollah to the Houthis.
And its famous strategic patience, right?
Yes. They argue all of that has always pointed toward a much larger horizon. They literally say the idea was always, quote, the whole Earth.
The whole Earth. To justify that massive leap from a regional border dispute to the whole Earth, the author breaks down what they view as a deeply historical, religiously infused playbook.
They write, fear before conquest and subjugation. That is not a new playbook. And then they draw a direct, very provocative parallel to the strategies of the first Arab tribes during the early Islamic expansions.
They argue that historically, there were relentless raids and the deliberate sowing of dread long before there were actual territorial conquests.
You sow the terror first.
Right. You demonstrate absolute power. You make the surrounding populations feel the dread in their bones.
So that by the time you actually advance to conquer, their psychological resistance is already broken.
Applying our neutral analytical lens here, it's vital to see how the author is constructing this narrative bridge between the 7th century and 2026.
Yeah, they are taking modern macroeconomics, the idle factories in Germany, the expensive fertilizer in Argentina, the spiked fuel in Japan.
And they are framing them as the modern, high-tech equivalent of an ancient raiding party.
Right. The dread isn't delivered by cavalry over a sand dune anymore.
No, it's delivered instantly via global market crashes.
Supply chain shortages.
And the flashing red numbers on a commodities terminal.
Now, if you're listening to this and thinking, this sounds incredibly alarmist, the whole Earth.
Surely that's just rhetorical bluster from the regime, not a practical military objective.
Right. If you're thinking that, you are exactly who the author is trying to shake awake. By expanding the scope from a regional territorial dispute to a literal planetary ideological war.
The author is systematically trying to force the international community off the sidelines.
That is the exact rhetorical utility of framing the threat as planetary.
Because if the conflict is just a regional dispute over borders in the Middle East, a government in South America or East Asia can comfortably say, well, that is a tragedy, but it's not our fight.
We maintain neutrality and trade with everyone.
Exactly. But the author is trying to strip away the comfort of that distance.
If the ideological goal of the regime is global subjugation and the economic terror of the Hormuz closure is already hitting your shores and starving your citizens,
then you are already in the war. You just haven't realized it yet.
The author is demanding that Europe, Asia, and Latin America recognize that their immediate localized economic suffering is not a byproduct of someone else's war.
It is a feature of a larger ideological design aimed directly at them.
But realizing that the threat is planetary and the ideology is absolute naturally destroys the existing diplomatic framework.
Of course it does. If the regime's goal is your ultimate subjugation, your options for dealing with it shrink dramatically.
Right. Because the standard operating procedure for international relations over the last 40 years has been incrementalism.
Yeah, the toolkit is always the same. You apply economic sanctions, you offer sanctions relief in exchange for verifiable pauses in nuclear enrichment.
Or pauses in proxy funding.
You engage in multilateral diplomatic talks in Vienna or Geneva. You try to find a middle ground where both sides can claim a victory.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the author looks at that entire paradigm of statecraft and declares it utterly, irredeemably dead.
Dead on arrival. They write that half measures and diplomatic engagement have repeatedly failed.
But they don't just say diplomacy was ineffective. They attack the fundamental premise of diplomacy itself when applied to this specific regime.
The text explicitly states, engagement was never a path to moderation. It was a tactic to buy time.
Let's look at the mechanics of buying time. The author is arguing that while Western diplomats are sitting at mahogany tables arguing over the phrasing of a nuclear accord,
the regime is using those months and years to harden its underground bunkers,
expand its missile production, deeply embed its proxy militias across the region.
The West thinks it's negotiating a genuine off-ramp, while the regime views the negotiation table simply as a shield to hide behind while it builds a bigger sword.
This brings us to the crux of the author's binary worldview. To the author, trying to change the nature of a theocratic regime through negotiations is, quote, a fool's errand.
The author believes the West fundamentally misunderstands the adversary by projecting its own values onto them.
Western leaders assume everyone ultimately wants economic prosperity and integration into the global market.
But the author argues that this regime prioritizes ideological purity and expansion above the economic well-being of its own citizens.
Therefore, you cannot reform it.
You cannot reason with it.
You cannot contain it.
You can only collapse it.
So what does this all mean? It's the difference between trying to negotiate a new lease with a difficult landlord versus realizing that the landlord is actively, right now, trying to demolish the entire building with you inside it.
That's a great analogy.
Right. If you think it's a lease dispute, you sit at the table, you haggle over the rent, you compromise. That's diplomacy.
But if you see the landlord swinging a wrecking ball at the foundation,
you don't negotiate the rent. You either evacuate the building or you overthrow the landlord.
And the author is screaming at the international community that the wrecking ball is swinging. Hormuz is closed, the global economy is fracturing, and diplomats are still trying to negotiate the rent.
Exactly. And because they believe the wrecking ball is already making contact, they state their conclusion with absolute clarity. The only way out is regime collapse.
Not regime change orchestrated by a foreign military invasion, but internal collapse.
Which opens up a massive, glaring question.
It really does.
If diplomacy is a fool's errand and regime collapse is the only option to save the global economy from these choke point terror attacks, who exactly is supposed to execute this collapse?
Right, because you might expect an author writing about the closure of the world's most critical oil artery to call for a massive deployment of the U.S. Navy.
Or a coordinated NATO bombing campaign.
But they don't. The author places the burden of regime collapse squarely and heavily on the shoulders of the Iranian diaspora.
The millions of exiled citizens living abroad in North America, Europe, and elsewhere.
The author argues that exiled communities have toppled dictatorships before. They point to historical precedents where diasporas used their access to Western capital, media, and political corridors to apply coordinated pressure.
To fund underground resistance and provide the moral clarity needed to delegitimize a regime globally.
But having set that expectation, the author follows it up with a blistering, almost bitter critique of the current state of the Iranian diaspora.
They describe the diaspora as deeply fragmented, paralyzed by infighting over historical grievances,
allowing its energy to be dissipated in symbolic feel-good gestures.
They summarize the diaspora's current impact on the ground inside Iran as being, quote, missing in action.
And then the author gets incredibly specific, taking direct, personalized aim at the most prominent figure in the exile community.
Reza Pahlavi, the exiled crown prince of Iran.
The author's frustration with Pahlavi practically bleeds through the page.
They complain that he has deeply disappointed the movement because he possesses the, quote, demeanor of a constitutional monarch.
They describe his tone as measured, ceremonial, and entirely disconnected from the raw, bloody reality of what is happening on the streets of Tehran or Zahedan.
The author uses a specific image to encapsulate this failure of leadership. The quote is, "I see nothing but Reza giving a speech here, a speech there on YouTube."
I want to pause here because this is where the text gets really challenging. Is the author holding an exiled figurehead to an impossible standard?
Yeah, I mean, the author has total disdain for these YouTube speeches, but
Yeah.
if you think about Pahlavi's life, he has spent decades acting as a unifying symbol of cultural heritage.
A bridge to a pre-revolutionary past.
Exactly. He is trying to project stability to Western governments who might fear what comes after the regime collapses.
So is it fair to expect a regal figure to suddenly act like a clandestine guerrilla commander orchestrating sabotage?
It might seem completely unfair to us sitting here analyzing it, but the author's underlying argument is that history doesn't care about fairness or personal comfort zones.
Right. If someone claims the mantle of leadership or allows themselves to be positioned as the figurehead of a liberation movement, they have to accept the brutal logistical realities of what overthrowing a totalitarian surveillance state actually requires.
The author is arguing that you cannot defeat a ruthless, ideologically driven security apparatus with a dignified bearing and a well-produced webcam monologue.
So the author is demanding that the symbolic heart of the movement also act as the ruthless operational brain of a revolution.
And when Pahlavi acts like the symbolic heart, giving a speech at a think tank or posting a video, the author is furious that he isn't acting like a battlefield general.
But the author isn't just throwing stones. They don't just complain about the YouTube videos. They pivot and provide a very granular, demanding blueprint of what they believe the operational brain of the diaspora should be doing.
Right, they call for the immediate creation of a common minimum program.
This is a fascinating pivot in the text, where it shifts from grand, geopolitical sweeping statements about planetary terror down to the gritty mechanics of organizing an insurgency.
The author outlines this common minimum program as a unifying platform focused on fundamental principles: human rights, democracy, free speech, and peaceful assembly.
But then they highlight one very specific, highly controversial aspect of freedom of religion.
They state that in a free society, someone can certainly choose to be Muslim, but they explicitly add, Muslims have a right to choose to no longer be Muslim.
Which strikes at the absolute core of the Islamic Republic's apostasy laws.
Precisely. The author goes even further, arguing that there is no liberation without attaining spiritual clarity on Islam.
They believe the political suppression in Iran is downstream of a theological suppression.
And they are deeply frustrated that the diaspora often sidelines or sanitizes this conversation to remain palatable to Western progressive sensibilities.
To the author, political regime collapse requires a preceding spiritual and ideological emancipation.
This raises an important question, because it's an incredible juxtaposition. They are pairing these massive, lofty goals, spiritual clarity, planetary emancipation, with intensely practical, almost dry logistical demands.
Right, because once they establish that common minimum program, they immediately start listing the missing practical instruments required to execute it.
They literally list them out like a project manager finding gaps in a supply chain.
Umbrella organizations, aggressive membership drives in the West,
Secure communication networks that can penetrate the regime's internet blackouts.
coordinated fundraising mechanisms that bypass international sanctions.
And physical bases for logistical support in neighboring countries.
If you've ever studied how the French resistance operated during World War II, this sounds exactly like an insurgency operating system.
Yeah. The French resistance had to shift from intellectuals printing underground newspapers in Parisian basements to actually coordinating railway sabotage.
Smuggling down Allied pilots, funding clandestine radio operators.
The author is essentially saying the Iranian diaspora is stuck in the printing underground newspapers phase, and they need to upgrade to coordinating railway sabotage.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The author paints an incredibly vivid, condemning picture of the limits of rhetoric. They write, speeches on YouTube may inspire, but they do not smuggle medicine, fund satellite internet, or coordinate strikes by workers in key refineries.
Think about the actual mechanics of what the author is demanding here. How does a group of exiles sitting in Los Angeles or London or Paris actually fund a labor strike by petrochemical workers in southern Iran?
It requires an immense invisible infrastructure.
You need Hawala networks to move untraceable funds. You need cryptocurrency pipelines.
You need to physically smuggle Starlink terminals across heavily guarded borders, so activists can upload footage when the regime cuts the fiber optic lines.
You need safe houses.
The author is stating that building this infrastructure is the actual work of revolution. They don't need another brand ambassador pitching the vision of a free Iran.
They need a ruthless operations team.
They are demanding the machinery of regime collapse. You can have the most beautiful democratic vision in the world, but if you don't have the logistics to pay a striking worker's rent so their family doesn't starve, your revolution fails.
And the most tragic part of the author's argument is that they believe this machinery should have already been built.
Yeah, they point to a specific date in the recent past, February 14th, 2026, as a massive blown opportunity.
They lament the, quote, heroic Iranian diaspora, February 14th, 2026.
The text describes this date as a fleeting, agonizing moment of global visibility. It was a day of massive protests, trending hashtags, impassioned speeches.
Promises of unbreakable solidarity. For a brief window, the international community actually looked past the Israel lens and saw the Iranian people.
But the author notes that the moment passed. The world's attention moved on to the next crisis.
Why? Because, as the author puts it, the courage of that day was never institutionalized.
Institutionalizing courage. It's a striking phrase.
It really is. The author is arguing that raw emotional energy, outrage, and bravery on the streets are highly perishable resources.
Right. If you don't have the umbrella organizations, the secure comms, and the strike funds already built to capture that energy and channel it into sustained systemic disruption, the energy simply dissipates.
The regime brings out the riot police, cuts the internet, and waits for the diaspora's outrage to burn itself out.
The author is haunted by this. It implies that courage alone is never enough to defeat a totalitarian state.
You have to bolt it down. You have to build a resilient, well-funded institution around it. Otherwise, you're just sacrificing brave kids on the streets for retweets.
Now, to fully grasp the weight, the urgency, and frankly, the eccentricity of this argument, we have to zoom out.
Right. We need to look at the broader context of the source material itself, because the environment this specific post lives in on the Barack Face blog is absolutely fascinating and recontextualizes everything we've just discussed.
Remember the author's bio, Barack Obama's first full-time volunteer in New York City.
That implies a background in American grassroots organizing, data-driven political campaigns, conventional progressive politics.
Yet here they are in 2026 writing with fierce, almost militant urgency about the logistics of regime change in the Middle East.
But when you look at the margins of the source material, the sidebar of the blog, the other posts, the books the author has recently published, it paints a picture of a mind deeply obsessed with massive, world-altering macro trends that go far beyond standard geopolitics.
The eclectic nature of the author's focus is startling.
It's wild. You have posts analyzing AI in global education.
You have deep dives into Indian domestic politics, specifically analyzing the mechanics of Modi's vast rallies.
You have books listed about the explosion of something called agentic AI in 2026.
And then there are these deeply philosophical, almost esoteric texts about a concept called Kalkiism,
which the author subtitles as the economic and spiritual blueprint for an age of abundance.
Okay, we need to define some of these terms for anyone who isn't steeped in futurism or Eastern theology, because it explains the author's mindset.
Definitely. Let's start with agentic AI. It isn't just a chatbot that writes emails for you.
Right. Agentic AI refers to artificial intelligence systems that can be given a high-level goal, like optimize this supply chain or launch this business, and the AI can autonomously break that goal down into steps.
Navigate the internet, interact with other software, and execute actions in the real world without human supervision.
It's the moment AI goes from being an oracle that answers questions to an agent that does work.
And then you have Kalkiism. In Hindu eschatology, Kalki is the prophesied 10th and final avatar of the god Vishnu.
Right, and Kalki is destined to appear at the end of the Kali Yuga,
the dark age of moral decline, hypocrisy, and suffering.
He appears to destroy filth and usher in a new golden epoch of spiritual and material abundance.
So we have an author who started in Obama's grassroots campaigns, who is now writing about autonomous AI agents executing tasks and framing the future through the lens of a Hindu prophecy about destroying the dark age to birth a golden era of abundance.
It's a lot to take in.
It really is. How does a mind that is swimming in those waters look at the Strait of Hormuz?
This is the critical synthesis. The author doesn't view the Strait of Hormuz as just a geopolitical crisis. They view it as a systemic, planetary choke point for history itself.
Wow.
The author's looking at a world that is on the absolute bleeding edge of an AI revolution. A world that has the technological capacity to enter an age of abundance where energy, education, and resources could be plentiful.
But standing in the way of that utopian convergence is an archaic 20th century totalitarian regime using the 7th century playbook of the first Arab tribes to hold the 21st century global economy hostage.
Exactly.
So to this author, the Islamic Republic isn't just a bad government. It is the literal embodiment of the Kali Yuga.
Is the Dark Age actively trying to strangle the Golden Age in its crib?
When you understand that the author views the world as being on the precipice of a technological and spiritual leap forward, their intense frustration with incremental diplomacy finally makes complete sense.
It really does.
Yeah.
If you believe humanity is trying to birth an age of abundance, but a theocracy is choking the global supply chain to fund proxy wars, you don't have time for half measures in Geneva.
The window to secure the future is incredibly narrow.
The stakes are planetary. The regime is a fundamental roadblock to human evolution, and therefore the machinery of its collapse must be built immediately.
Let's take a deep breath and summarize the intense, sweeping journey this author has taken us on.
We started by looking at a map, reframing the Strait of Hormuz from a simple nautical choke point to the site of a planetary terror attack.
We examined the exact economic mechanics of how blocking that artery instantly starves factories in Europe and raises food prices in Latin America, acting as a modern-day raiding party designed to sow global dread.
We unpacked the author's fierce rejection of the Israel lens, arguing that the regime's true ambition has always been ideological subjugation on a planetary scale.
We explored the mathematical logic behind the author's total dismissal of diplomacy, viewing engagement not as a path to peace, but as a tactical shield used by the regime to buy time.
We analyzed the wrecking ball analogy, leading to the author's absolute demand for internal regime collapse.
And then we dug into that searing, granular critique of the Iranian diaspora, the author's demand to move past the symbolic comfort of YouTube speeches and build a ruthless insurgency operating system.
Complete with secure comms, strike funds, and smuggled tech, all based on a common minimum program demanding spiritual clarity.
And finally, we zoomed out to see the mind behind the text. An author obsessed with agentic AI, global abundance, and Kalkiism, who views the closure of Hormuz not merely as a threat to oil prices, but as the ultimate clash between a desired future of human flourishing and the ancient forces of subjugation.
It is a text that demands the world wake up, recognize the terrifying fragility of its own systems, and fundamentally change its strategy before the window to the future closes.
It is incredibly heavy, deeply provocative stuff. But before we sign off, we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something that builds on the underlying terror of this text, but pushes it a little further into your own everyday reality.
Consider the extreme, almost invisible vulnerability of the deeply interconnected world the author describes.
The text meticulously showed how a single geographic choke point, a narrow strip of water, can be turned into a weapon of global economic terror without a single bomb being dropped.
It forces us to ask a chilling question. What other invisible choke points are out there, quietly holding up the architecture of your daily life?
Exactly. They aren't all physical waterways. Think about the digital realm.
What about the handful of undersea fiber optic cables that carry 95% of international data, financial transactions, and communications?
What happens if an autonomous submarine accidentally severs 3 of them in the Pacific?
Or think about the technological choke points. What about the Taiwan Strait, through which a massive percentage of the world's advanced microchips must travel?
The chips that run our cars, our hospitals, and the very AI systems this author dreams about.
Or agricultural choke points, specific straits that control the flow of grain from Eastern Europe.
Or the incredibly concentrated supply chains for the raw minerals required for electric vehicle batteries.
How many entirely unprotected, deeply fragile choke points are currently sitting out there in the dark, just waiting for a state actor or a rogue organization to quietly flip the switch and watch the systemic single points of failure cascade?
It goes right back to what we said at the very beginning of this deep dive. You look at the map of your life, the food at your grocery store, the phone in your hand, the gas in your car, and it feels like solid, permanent architecture.
But the arteries keeping that life functioning might be far more fragile, far more targeted, and far more invisible than we ever realized.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking the hard questions, keep looking for the hidden narratives and choke points behind the global events, and we will catch you next time.